these are the things we're going to consider. Many approaches. So Freud stuff we looked at, Adler stuff, Jung stuff, behavioural stuff that we're coming to, and so on. Many approaches are more directive, and that basically means that the counsellor knows best. That the counsellor, the therapist, practitioner, whatever you want to call them, because they know best and they provide advice, or they are teaching the client, or basically they're telling the client what to do. The assumption that underlies that is that the client is not capable of understanding or resolving the problems without help. So, for example, going back to the Freud stuff, you can't look into your unconscious. You need the psychiatrist to help you explore your unconscious, and you also need the psychiatrist to help you understand what you find there in your unconscious. And so it's a logical argument, and you would also need the psychiatrist to help you to deal with whatever the problems are that need resolving, etc. The directive approach is really a focus on the problem rather than the client. And so if you go to a psychologist and the psychologist diagnoses you using the DSM or the ICD, or whatever approach, but they diagnose you with a particular problem, or you go to a psychiatrist, they diagnose you and prescribe medication or whatever. This is a directive approach. And the non-directive approach, which is what the person-centred approach is all about, is basically the opposite to all of these things. And so the alternative view is that the client is on a journey, and the counsellor is travelling with them. So rather than the counsellor telling them where the destination is, and how they're going to go about getting to the destination, and how long it should take, and basically acting as a tour guide, instead the counsellor is on that journey with them, sharing it with them. And indeed the counsellor, because they don't know where the journey is going to go, they don't know where the destination is, etc., and therefore the counsellor is not all-knowing. The therapist is not the paragon, the guru, etc. And so, by extension, both the counsellor and the client are fallible. The non-directive approach, this person-centred approach, is also about self-actualization, and I'll come back to that when I talk briefly about Maslow's stuff in a little while. This approach says that the personal characteristics of the therapist and the relationship between the therapist and the client are critical to the success. And indeed, plenty of research indicates that this is true. And even if you use a directive approach, so if you are a psychologist who diagnoses and then treats in any kind of approach, the research indicates that the relationship is critical and is probably the most important aspect, the biggest influence on the likelihood of success for any approach. And if it's not a good relationship, it's not likely they're going to keep a client anyway. So the client will probably stop turning up to therapy, will find someone else, or be turned off therapy entirely and seek no further treatment. It's all about creating a growth-promoting climate, and I'll talk about growth in a moment. This approach has a view that everybody is capable of improvement, is capable of growth, is capable of becoming more, is capable of becoming better, etc. If this growth-promoting climate is provided. So if the ideal situation, conditions, environment is provided, then anybody can improve. This approach presumes humans are, at their core, trustworthy and positive. And so while people might do negative things, people might do bad things, people might feel bad, people might have a pessimistic outlook on life and so on, and plenty of people do see the negatives in the world around them, etc. and do experience things in a negative way, and so on. But this approach says that that is less natural, and anybody can be assisted to have a more positive outlook on life. Everybody has a core that is trustworthy and positive, etc. It just has to be nurtured, uncovered, developed, and so on. Everybody's capable of making changes and living in productive and effective ways. And that we have an innate and inbuilt, a natural drive towards self-actualization, and someone who's seeking assistance. A big part of that assistance is to work out what is blocking that self-actualization and find ways of helping the client remove that blockage so they can continue on the journey to becoming self-actualized. It also presumes that humans want to move forward. They want to find creative ways to be better, etc. So, growth promoting climate, that involves providing an environment of congruence. So congruence is basically when the ideal self matches the actual self. So you think about who you want to be, what you want to be, the elements about you that you want. So that's in terms of your job, in terms of relationships, in terms of your personality, in terms of mood, in terms of how you approach life, the world around you, etc. So who would you like to be? To be completely congruent, who you'd like to be is who you are. Or the other way to think about it, who you are is who you want to be. You can also argue that if that is the case, so if you are congruent, then you don't really have much more of a journey to go on, and so there is an argument to say that you shouldn't be completely congruent, because then if you're already perfect, why go on? Congruence is also about being genuine, and that's to yourself in particular, and unless you are genuine to yourself, then you can't be genuine and real to others. So if you have a facade, so if you have things about yourself that you cover, that you hide, that you don't express to the world, or admit to yourself and so on, then you are lacking in congruence, lacking in genuineness, in realness, etc. So to provide a climate in which growth is possible, the therapist needs to be congruent. So this is more about the therapist rather than the client. The therapist needs to provide unconditional positive regard, and so regardless of what the client may have done, regardless of what the client is like in terms of their personality, their emotions, their thinking patterns, and so on, regardless of all of that, you have to be accepting and caring of them, and this has to be natural. It shouldn't be an act, because if it is an act, if it's forced, then unless you're very good at it, then the client will pick it, and the client will recognise that you are being condescending, that you are not being truthful with them, etc. So unconditional positive regard isn't easy, but neither is congruence for that matter. An accurate empathic understanding. So I'm not going to talk about empathy versus sympathy and so on, because I've put a thing on the forum. I want to hear what your thoughts are about empathy and sympathy. 6 core therapeutic conditions that are necessary for personality changes to occur, but also sufficient for personality changes to occur. So that sufficient bit means that as long as you've got these 6 things, that's enough. And you must have these 6 things in order for it to be enough. For personality changes to occur, now there's a whole argument as to how changeable personality is. So some people believe, and when I say some people, I don't just mean ordinary people in inverted commas, but also science, learned people, psychologists and so on. Some people believe that change is possible in terms of your personality, and others believe that it is not. So for example, Freud said basically once you hit puberty, once you've dealt with puberty, then your personality is set. And indeed may have been said before that. depending on whether you got fixated at an earlier stage or not. Other approaches also say, well, in fact many approaches say that once your personality is set, and it differs when it becomes set, once your personality is set, it doesn't really change that much. Erickson, which we don't cover, says that personality develops throughout the lifespan, and it is determined by how you resolve crises at a variety of points during your life. The trait approach, and so the current approach is, well, the current most accepted approach to understanding personality is the trait approach, and the main theory or the main model in that is the Big Five approach, or the Big Five model, which says that we have 5 super factors. OCEAN, so O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. And by the time you are sort of late 20s, early 30s or so, your personality is basically set in those 5 dimensions. It doesn't change. The person-centered approach, however, says that personality is changeable, and as long as you've got these things in place, then your personality can change. Two-person psychological contact, so there's more to the relationship than just talking. There's incongruence in the client, but not in the therapist. The therapist is congruent and integrated into the relationship between the therapist and the client. Unconditional positive regard, or talk about that. Empathy for client's internal frame of reference. So have an understanding of what's inside the client. Basically, have an understanding and respect for the way the client sees the world, and so on. And communication, which is a hallmark of relationships. Communication is needed and is achieved. The therapist, a non-directive, person-centered therapist, focuses on the relationship, not surprisingly. Is not really interested in assessment and diagnosis per se, because it's all about growth, improvement, change, and so on, rather than the condition that you have and the treatment that's required. Provides supportive therapeutic environment in which the client is the agent of change and healing. So that bit, the client is the agent of change and healing, is important. It basically means that the client has to come up with the ideas. The client has to determine what might or might not work. The client has to build their agenda for change, etc. A good therapist will kind of pull this stuff from the client, but it has to come from the client. The therapist can make suggestions, but couched in more in terms of, what do you think of this, or here's how others may have approached this. Do you think that might work for you, etc. It's always put back to the client for them to determine, them to consider, etc. Serves as a model struggling toward greater realness, so it goes back to the congruence thing, and the therapist should demonstrate that they too are learning, that they too are improving, that they too are on the journey of change, etc. And when you are actually doing therapy using this approach, you might disclose elements about your own life and so on that reflect your own journey towards change, etc. Genuine, integrated, authentic, without a false front. So if you're trying to put on a mask for the client, if you're trying to demonstrate, or you're trying to indicate, or trying to show elements that are not really you, then you are doing your client a disservice, according to this approach. Can openly express feelings and attitudes that are present in relationship with the client. So you need to be able to challenge the client. You need to be able to reflect back to the client things that they may not necessarily want to know or not want to hear, and so on. In the same way, for any good relationship, there needs to be honesty and openness, etc. The therapist is also invested in developing their own life experiences. So the therapist is on a journey as well, already said that. conditions for creativity, acceptance, sort of talked about, non-judgmental, empathy, psychological. I don't think there's anything extra there really that I haven't already mentioned. So the creativity thing is basically providing an environment in which the client can become creative about themselves, about what they might want to change, how they might change it, a timeline of how that might occur, things they might try, etc. Because it's, as I said before, all this stuff's got to come from the client. So the client has got to be creative, and there must be reasons why the client is not being particularly creative or whatever before coming to see you. And so through the relationship, through the environment that you set up, the situation that you set, and so on, you allow the client to develop this about themselves. Motivational interviewing is a more directive approach to person-centred counselling. So it's a later model that has a degree of directiveness to it, because most people don't like change. Most people are comfortable or prefer comfort, prefer routine, and so on. And if you think about it, when you travel to work, or travel to uni, or travel to wherever, when you travel, you always take the same route. When running classes, I observe that students, after the first week or two, generally sit in the same chairs in the same area of the room each week. People have their meal times, similar time of day, each day, do the similar sorts of things, have routines for when they get up in the morning and so on. We gravitate to routine, like routine. We don't like change, and there are plenty of good reasons for that. So one, it becomes predictable, it becomes easy, doesn't require energy, it doesn't require mental energy, physical energy, or whatever to come up with change, to be more spontaneous, etc. And so because of that, it is challenging to get change in a client, and so a degree of directiveness may be required to kind of push them out of their comfort zone, to push the client in the direction of change, etc., to help them commit to an agenda for change, and to implement a plan, and so on. And so there's mention in the text about the stages of change model, also called the trans-theoretical model, which says there are a number of stages to change, and different versions of this presented in different ways, but it's often most commonly in a cycle. So at the pre-contemplation stage, so each of these stages in the model, at the pre-contemplation stage, you haven't even thought about change. You're not thinking about it, you're not wanting change, and so on. You just it's like zero. At the contemplation stage, you think, yeah, maybe I should change. Maybe I am a bit unfit. Maybe I am a bit overweight. Maybe I am a bit grumpy in the mornings. Maybe I do procrastinate a bit much, or whatever. And these things, or this thing, does cause problems. So maybe I should do something about that one day. Preparation. So you're starting at the preparation stage. You're starting to think more seriously about it. You haven't actually done anything yet, or if you have, then you may have made an attempt to change. You may have set a New Year's resolution and tried to give up smoking, for example, or you may have bought a self-help book and flicked through and looked at the pictures, read the blurb on the back flap or whatever. You may have, whatever you've done, it's not sufficient to actually make a difference, but you've made a start. You've actually turned thinking into some degree of behaviour, some degree of change. In the action stage, you're doing something about it, something serious about it. So for example, preparation stage, you might have joined the gym, but not be in a regular like pattern of going. In the action stage, you are going on a regular basis, 3 nights a week, for example, or you've taken up jogging, and each morning you jog, or whatever it is. In the action stage, there's action. In the maintenance stage, so during the action stage, it requires effort. It requires conscious, deliberate effort. So you have to make yourself go to the gym, or you have to, you are regularly beset by urges to light a cigarette, or to smoke crack cocaine, or whatever it is you're into. You are having to make a conscious effort to try and stay on the straight and narrow, on your path to change, or whatever. In the maintenance stage, you are no longer having to put anywhere near as much effort into it. It's now becoming like whatever you've changed, it's now becoming like second nature. And so if anything, you feel like bad, you feel guilty, you feel incomplete if you haven't been out for your morning run, or if you whatever it is you're trying to change. It's no longer such an effort. Relapse, and this is not really, relapse can occur, and it's the problem with this diagram is that relapse can really occur at any of these stages. So you can drop from action back to preparation, from preparation back to contemplation, from maintenance back to action, etc. And so relapse can occur at any of these points, where you go back to an early stage of development. An earlier stage of the process. If you are in maintenance stage for long enough, then it just becomes like, it just stabilizes into, and it's a new you. And so you are no longer having to think about it and put any extra effort or whatever. It's just part of who you are now, this new person. And so the stage of change model is used for all sorts of things, and there's a degree of success for all sorts of things, whether it's giving up smoking, taking up exercise, and all sorts of other things. Emotion-focused therapy has elements of Gestalt and existential therapies to it, and it's all about emotion, clearly. It's called emotion-focused, understanding the emotion and being able to examine the experience of emotion, and using emotion, positive and negative, using emotion to provide a pathway to making cognitive and behavioural change. Reflective learning is developing, so having an awareness of your behaviour and of your thinking and of your emotion and so on, through feedback loops, and being able to make change. So in theory, with this sort of stuff, once you understand it, and so once the therapist has helped you with change or whatever, you should be able to apply to anything on your own. So you should be aware of your own behaviours, and recognise like things that are stopping you from changing in a positive manner and so on, and being able to do something about them yourself. So once you've, for example, given up smoking, you should be able to, on your own, you should be able to improve your fitness or whatever. And we are constantly doing this sort of stuff. So you attempt something, assess its effectiveness, make judgments, make adjustments, attempt it again, assess its effect, and so on, and it just becomes a continuous cycle. There's not really much in the text about Maslow's stuff, but I'll briefly mention it because it's often included when talking about the humanistic approach and so on. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is always presented as a triangle or as a pyramid or whatever, and it says that so at each level of needs, on the other reason to briefly talk about this is there are elements of it that students often misunderstand. So generally everyone understands that you have to satisfy the lower level needs before you can move on to the upper level needs, but it's not the case. It's a stage-based thing, and once you've satisfied one level, you move on to the next. Once you satisfy that, you move on to the next, and so on. You're actually constantly moving around and working on. You can work on multiple levels at the same time. So I'll give you some examples. But first of all, so the needs are physiological needs. So that's related to your body, so hunger, thirst, and so on. Safety and security needs. So physiological needs: do you have enough food and water to survive? Long-term survival: do you have shelter to survive, to protect you from the elements, to protect you from the marauding dingoes and all that sort of stuff? Belongingness and love: are you important to somebody else? Esteem needs: are you capable of something that's useful, something that's of value to others, and so on? Do you have a contribution that you can make, and so you can feel good about your place and what you contribute to society, and so on? These are the deficiency needs, where if you are lacking, so if you're deficient in these things, then you have to do something about fulfilling that deficiency. And when you do, you get pleasure. So, for example, if you're particularly thirsty, if it's a really hot day, you haven't drunk and you haven't drunk enough, and so on, then nothing tastes better than a cold glass of water. And yet, any other day, any other ordinary day, then you generally don't notice the taste of water. It's just prefer soft drink, prefer alcohol, prefer whatever. But when it's satisfying a need, you derive pleasure. And so, for example, an apple. If you go to an Asian country and you heed the advice that says don't eat anything that you can't peel, don't eat any, etc. And so you haven't eaten, while you've been backpacking for 3 months, you haven't eaten any apples, and then you return back to Australia, and the first apple that you tastes like the best apple you've ever had. Pleasure. The pleasure you get from like a warm embrace, a hug, from intimate sex, and so on. Esteem, and so in that regard, pleasure is pride in being able to achieve, etc. For these upper level needs that are growth needs, things you do to improve rather than things that you do to fill gaps, provide happiness. So for the cognitive needs, so it's knowledge and understanding, and so just gaining knowledge, which you are doing right now. Doesn't it feel good? Aesthetic needs, that's about order and beauty, and then self-actualization, and then often there's one at the top that's at the very top, which is often labelled as transcendence, and so that's at the very top where you're helping others to achieve self-actualization and so on. And as I started to say before, even if you're not currently hungry, not currently thirsty, and so on, and because of that, and most Westerners, if you're not homeless, most Westerners don't really have to worry about safety and security, and so they can be working on this stuff. But most people on a daily basis, they feel hungry, they feel thirsty, etc. And so if you haven't eaten or drunk for a while and you're feeling hungry or thirsty, then the physiological need of hunger takes priority, and you can't. And so when people are, if you're at work, for example, and it's getting late in the day and you haven't eaten, and you can't really focus, you can't really concentrate on what you're supposed to be doing because of your hunger. And so there's an example of that physiological need trumping the esteem needs, or whatever it is that you're doing, these needs, and you're having to basically return to that level, eat something, before you can then go back to focusing on what you're doing. So we're constantly, on a daily basis, moving up and down. You always have to put work into relationships. There's always more to learn about whatever it is that you're good at. You always have to think about whether it's safe to walk down that alleyway, whether you've parked your car in a safe place, etc. So you're always moving backwards and forwards around these needs. It's not until you are meeting these needs that really you can be moving, you're going to be operating in these upper levels, in these growth needs. This is I'm not going to go through them, but this is a list of stuff that demonstrates self-actualization. And they're not all positive. There are some negatives. So people who are self-actualized, there are some negatives that impact others. So people who are self-actualized are ruthless because humanity is more important than the individual. And whatever your life mission is, so there's a life mission. Whatever your life mission is more important than your little needs, etc. They're absent-minded. So they're not people operating in self-actualization stage. Not good at looking after themselves because they don't really care about what they wear. They don't really care about what they eat, etc. They don't really care about personal grooming, personal hygiene, etc. So they may not shower for days, for example. So someone who is self-actualized, to make a go of it, really, you need to have someone else who's looking after you, who's not self-actualized. They're too generous. They experience guilt and anxiety because there's always more to be done with whatever your life mission is and whatever you're doing. There's always more work somewhere in the world and so on. So self-actualization is not an end point. It's the start of the journey. So having satisfied all this stuff, even though it's near the top, it's only the start because it signals that there is so much more to be done across the world for humanity, etc. Only 1%, according to research, less than 1% of the population reach self-actualization stage, and there's a number of reasons why. So less than 1 in 100. There's a number of reasons why that occurs. So one is because you always have to work on the lower level needs first. Culture stifles, and so all cultures, in order to keep in order to keep order, there are laws and regulations, there are morals and so on that must be adhered to in order for society to continue to function. The fact that there are multiple codes of laws, multiple codes of morals and so on, indicates that there's not one universal set, and therefore whichever culture you're in potentially stifles your behaviours, your creativity, your actions, etc. As I said earlier, most people prefer the routine, the predictable and so on, to be self-actualized. You can't have that. You've got to have growth. You've got to take risks. You've got to be spontaneous. You've got to be prepared to fail, and so on. That doesn't fit most people. And the Jonah complex. So there's the idea that something could go wrong. And so you're being spontaneous and saying yes to something, to an opportunity where there's a huge risk of failure. For example, most people would say no, they prefer not to risk it. How to become and so there are a number of ways you can increase the likelihood of being self-actualized. So paying more attention to the world around you, making risky choices, trusting yourself and your own intuition, telling the truth. And so a self-actualizer, so someone who's working in that, always tells the truth, because lies take too much effort, and it's a waste of effort if you have to remember what you've said to whom, etc. And so that's the thing about being ruthless. And so, does my butt look big in this? Yes, I'm afraid it does. You really should exercise more. And so clearly, honesty is not always the best policy in terms of relationships, in terms of like social mores and so on. However, it is the best policy in terms of working towards self-actualization, and so you will be honest. This requires discipline, big experiences, so it's like a religious experience like flow, etc. So it's like being experiencing oneness with the world around you, etc., but non-chemical. Dumping baggage, so many people like to be martyrs. Many people cling to the disadvantages that they've had. They like to have things that they can blame. So I'm like this because of my parents. I'm like this because I'd say no because I don't have enough money to follow my dreams. I have responsibilities, and so I can't take the opportunities, etc. Most people cling to these sorts of things as excuses, and that's what they are. They're excuses. And so finding ways around these things is what a self-actualizer would do. Okay, so all that's well and good and great, but there are problems with the person-centered approach to the humanistic approach. So one is it's more art than science. So because there's not a set of standardized steps, a set of standardized techniques and so on, it's hard to teach this sort of stuff, and it's hard to define it, and it comes down to basically how well the individual therapist can do it. So how congruent the individual therapist is, how well that individual therapist can express the unconditional positive regard stuff, how good that individual therapist is at pulling from the client options for change without being too directive about it, etc. Part of the process requires a degree of directionality, or directness, where you may have to challenge the client. So you may have to say, well, you just, based on everything that I've heard, you're just clinging to baggage. You're making excuses for yourself. You are being weak. Whatever it is, you have to be prepared to challenge the client, but in a supportive manner, which is not easy. Not only doing it, but being able to determine when is the best time to do it, when is the best time to challenge the client. And there's an art to that, recognising when it will work and when it won't work. And indeed, in any good relationship, you should be able to be honest, but to know when and how to be honest. So rather than just saying, yes, your butt does look big in that, being able to express that in a way that is supportive, express that in a way that will lead to positive change, as opposed to expressing it in a way that will result in a fight, that will result in defensiveness, that will result in hurt, etc. Another problem with this approach is that being a good model is not easy. So at the start, the therapist should be congruent. The therapist should be demonstrate that they are pursuing self-actualization, growth, positive change, etc. That's not easy, because it's not only clients not only those who have problems who are resistant to change. We are all resistant to change. You are all resistant to change. It presumes that personality can change, not just behaviour, that there are both stable and fluid elements to personality. And I talked about the changeability of personality earlier. It's also been criticised as a somewhat naive and optimistic approach, because it basically says that there is no evil in the world. People might do evil things, but there is good in everybody. And many people have difficulty accepting that. And we hear on the news on a regular basis about people who do particularly bad things, particularly cruel things, and so on, and you'd struggle to find a way of seeing something positive in that person. It is elitist and unobtainable, so the fact that less than 1% of the population actually get to self-actualization the focus on the individual, on the self and so on, is somewhat narcissistic and selfish.